Soapbox After Dark, everyone. And as normal, pants and sobriety are completely optional. I have my pants on. Sobriety is somewhat there. But welcome to the Soapbox. Let's do the news. I didn't necessarily have any intention on doing a show tonight. My wife and I did the Patron Appreciation Show earlier in the day. And I like to have 1 or 2 days where I don't necessarily, get on air. So Sundays are some of those days that I tend to reserve for myself. But I had this is one of those things that it's like nails on a chalkboard to me. And it's aggravating, and it's aggravating enough where at 12:36 in the morning I'm going to do the news. I had originally intended on doing this earlier, but I realized I was having these kind of micro sleeps, or I was dozing off slightly, and that's not necessarily the format where you want to do those. First, shout out to everybody that joined us for the Patron Appreciation. That was awesome. And for the last few Patron Appreciations, they've been really, really good shows. So those are available to patrons. And if someone is donating through PayPal or something to that effect, just let me know, and I'll shoot the link to the videos themselves. It turned out well. My wife has started to join me. Mrs. Thomas has started to join me for the shows, and it creates a certain degree of stability. It's like when you're doing things with somebody else, it's like you hold each other accountable for the show. And so she enjoys it. I enjoy it. And the audience seems to get a kick out of it. We do a week in review, and we essentially allow those to the patrons. It's the least that we can do to give back. And I'm trying to find ways to give additional content. So there's that part. The show is nearing 20,000 subscribers, so I want to thank all of you. If you enjoy the content, please consider sharing, liking, subscribing. And like I said, you can always support the PayPal or Patreon. All right, so let's do the news. What is put my panties in a bunch? So, what has gotten me out of bed? And I haven't been to bed, but what has gotten me to the point where I'm like, I'm gonna do the news? What is that fire that's in you? What is the thing that bugs you? This tweet by Bernie Sanders, one Mr. Bernie Sanders, right here. Sanders issues a tweet on Venezuela. What the hell? Let's see what's going on. There we are. Sometimes Streamlabs has odd behavior, man. Alright, so right here. The people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first, allowing humanitarian aid into the country and refrain from violence against protesters. Now, the propaganda that's been put forth is that Maduro is not allowing humanitarian aid into the country. Marco Rubio has taken to Twitter also, tweeting this. Gaddafi and Gaddafi. Essentially, Gaddafi being sodomized with a machete. This is the United States working with NATO in order to destroy a country, a prosperous nation at one point, and turned it effectively into a country where you can buy your own black slave. If that's what Rubio considers success, that is somewhat problematic. Here's the issue here. The premise that allows Rubio to get to that point of talking about regime change, Sanders agrees with. Sanders has been wishy-washy on Venezuela. Early on, he put out a tweet essentially saying Maduro is a horrible bad guy, he's a dictator, etc., 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 but you shouldn't overthrow him. Problem with that is you've already agreed with the first premise, and in one tweet after the next, you're agreeing with the first premise. This tweet, I say, is morally reprehensible and disingenuous, and to some degree, the moral reprehensibility of it comes from how disingenuous it is, because Sanders knows better. I'm going to make an argument, and in that argument, I'm going to try to make the case that this tweet is morally reprehensible because of how disingenuous it is. Meaning there's a certain degree of hypocrisy that's built within the argument itself that makes all of this narrative nonsensical. And Sanders is smart enough to know better. But there's a political reason that he's not going to, let's say, let that knowledge peek out, per se. That knowledge will peek out only to the degree that we shouldn't overthrow that country. But from the standpoint of taking the position, he would take the same thing with Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad is a horrible, bad, disgusting guy. He doesn't wash his hands after he goes to the bathroom. But we shouldn't overthrow him. He would take the same tact. It's easier sometimes to flow with the current and try to add in your opinion after the fact, as opposed to trying to push back against the current like Tulsi Gabbard is trying to do. I'm going to try to do this video in like 10 minutes. I don't think anybody's going to be up this late. I'm going to try to bang through these because I've done so many videos on Venezuela that I'm going to do bullet points. And I'm going to come back to this tweet because I want to have a conversation about the tweet after I go through my bullet points. So, first, Tillerson memo. Tillerson memo. If you don't remember, the Tillerson memo was a memo that was leaked that was giving Tillerson a primer on U.S. policy. Essentially, how the U.S. acts around the globe. It acts in the interest of the United States. Regardless of the freedom, democracy, and all this other stuff, the United States act within its own specific interests. The May 17 memo reads like a crash course for a businessman turned diplomat, and its conclusions offers a starkly realistic vision that the United States should use human rights as a club against its adversaries like Iran, China, North Korea, while giving a pass to repressive allies like the Philippines, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Allies should be treated differently and better than adversaries. Otherwise, we end up with more adversaries and fewer allies, argued the memo written by Tillerson's influential policy aide, Brian Hook. That's very important. I'm saying that to say, when you hear people use these terms of, oh, we care about the people of Venezuela, we care, we're bleeding hearts about the people of Libya, we got to do something about these things, something is taking place in the world, we got to do something, we got to do something. What do? What bomb do we drop? What proxy army do we use? Whose heads are we going to chop off? Like, it's this idea of humanitarian bombs. The point of the matter is this. We do things that are in our specific interests. And we ignore countries that are our allies that are repressive regimes, while simultaneously pointing a finger at countries that are not our allies. That's an important point to understand when looking at U.S. policy. The propaganda, freedom, justice, democracy, all that is nonsense. We work in our own specific interests. And we are perfectly okay with not speaking of the atrocities that are taking place within certain countries if those certain countries are our allies, while simultaneously screaming to high heaven when those countries are not. The second point, coups. The United States has pushed one coup after the next in Latin America. I don't even think this is controversial at this point. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Brazil. I'm missing some. One country after the next. We've put in brutal repressive regimes in order, Chile was the other one, in order to prevent left-wing movements from taking hold in the country. And not communistic movements, just moderate left-wing movements taking place in the country. We've crushed those, putting in dictators in order to ensure that our companies can keep our hands on those resources and we can keep those prices low by suppressing workers' movements in the various countries. Don't take my word for it. Like I said, this is not necessarily I'm shocking at this point. So we can start right here. I'm putting this document at the bottom. The U.S. had a similarly catastrophic hand in Chile in 1973 coup of a democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. In his place, the U.S. installed Augusto Pinochet, who went to lead a brutally violent and repressive military dictatorship in the country. And earlier than Chile, the CIA under President Dwight Eisenhower orchestrated yet another coup in Guatemala in 1954, deposing democratically elected Jacob Arbenz and replacing with yet another military dictator, Carlos Castillo Armas. A former CIA officer who trained Guatemalan guerrillas in 1954 even wrote in the Los Angeles Times about parallels between the regime change efforts then in Nicaragua in 1986. My point is, we've led bloody regimes in these various countries. The notion that we don't like dictators is nonsense. We love dictators. We've put in dictators in the various countries when we've toppled these countries. Democracies are messy. In a democracy, that democracy may decide that they want to use the resources of their particular nation for their nation. Well, they don't necessarily like that, especially in some of these Latin American countries, in which case we considered it our domain. So a dictator is one guy, one point of contact that you deal with. You give that guy weapons, he represses his country, and you keep a certain degree of influence, a sphere of influence. Like, I guess my point is this. The idea that we don't like dictators is nonsense. That's utter nonsense. We've installed one dictator after the next. The truth of the matter is we don't like dictators that are not in our pockets. If the dictator is not in our pockets, yeah, then we have a problem with that particular dictator. But this argument that Maduro is a dictator, Maduro is authoritarian, and he's a bad, bad guy, we got to do something about it, it's nonsense. It falls on its face, seeing as we have a litany of dictators that we're perfectly okay with. We don't say squat about the totalitarian government in Saudi Arabia. We don't say squat about what's taking place in Egypt, meaning the Sisi government in Egypt. We don't say squat about any of this stuff. About Erdogan in Turkey. None of this matters to us. But Venezuela, big deal. Maduro, bad guy, bad guy. We got to take him out. I would put to you this. You've been setting fires all across the globe. Why do you think this is going to be any different? What is the outcome? What is the expected outcome of this particular action? And compare it to the outcomes of various actions either in Libya or in Iraq. What were the outcomes? Third point. Abrams, Bolton, and Donald Trump as being the saviors of Venezuela is laughable on its face. Let's be very clear. Abrams, convicted of lying to Congress, and has been behind or covering up some of the worst atrocities that were taking place in South America, particularly with one of the cases being death squads, with him covering up massacres in these places and trying to get arms and weapons for people committing those massacres. Abrams is a war criminal in the truest, most honest sense of the word. Morally, bankrupt as an individual. That's the guy who they're putting up as being the point person for Venezuela. Come on. You're not even trying. John Bolton, the architect of the Iraq War, and even to this day, don't see anything wrong with going into that country and destroying that country. And right now, is trying to destroy Iran and is doing the same treatment to Venezuela. The secondary point. Sanctions. Sanctions are an act of war. Sanctions are not these pity-pat things. Sanctions are an act of war. You're essentially having a siege. If there was back in medieval times, it would be setting up siege equipment outside of a castle in order to starve the castle. But in this case, you're talking about a country. You're starving a country to death. You're starving it of materials, of its ability to get access to drugs and medicines and food and supplies, and etc., etc. Then simultaneously coming around saying, in spite of us putting our boot on your throat with these sanctions, we're going to offer you humanitarian aid now, as if we're somehow being beneficial to you. Like, this is utter nonsense. 500,000 kids died before the Iraq War under the sanctions that Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright put into place in Iraq. 500,000, 500,000 children died as a result of the sanctions. That's before Bush even invaded the country. I guess I'm making the point that sanctions are an act of war. This idea of squeezing an economy of a country and trying to make that country scream, with this idea of creating so much chaos in the country that the country implodes. Either the military chooses someone else, in which case you have the military fighting one another, or the country implodes. I mean, they're trying to create chaos into the country in order to make the country easy pickings. Last point. Maduro was elected. Before Maduro, Chavez was elected in various, multiple elections. I guess my point is this. Guaidó was not elected. He was pushed by the United States. The moment, if Maduro was deposed or if Maduro was escorted out, I guarantee you that there have been agreements between the United States and Guaidó with regards to the resources of Venezuela, meaning they would start selling those resources off as per some agreement. Right now, you have the United States offering millions of dollars to Guaidó. Not just that, you also have this thing where he's committing treason, literally, by definition, by working with a foreign power that's trying to take down the government, the elected government of Venezuela. Whatever you think of Maduro, it's somewhat irrelevant to this process. Venezuela has not attacked the United States. They've done nothing to us in this regard. The United States has continuously tried to attack that country in order to get its hand on those resources. And I'm saying it is none of our business. Whatever you want to think, whatever the chaos or whatever the mismanagement of the economy that might have taken place, Let's be very clear that it is the United States that is standing on the throat of Venezuela, making it difficult for that country to do anything in order to deal with the problems that's presenting it. Last point. The sending of aid. You're causing suffering and then sending aid after causing the suffering. It's just cynical. It's just entirely cynical with a propaganda war that's essentially pushing this idea that Venezuela is preventing aid. So let's go into Bernie Sanders' tweet. With just the background. Let's go into Sanders' tweet. The people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. Yes, a serious humanitarian crisis that's pushed and propagated by the United States using sanctions as economic siege warfare. I don't even think Sanders would disagree with that point. But that's the truth of the matter. Whatever they mismanage their economy, that's somewhat irrelevant, but that's an issue for the people of Venezuela to deal with. It has been taken advantage of in order to propagate regime change. And let's keep going. And it's not just me. There are other people that are beginning to notice. The Maduro government must put the needs of its people first and allow humanitarian aid into the country. Here's the catch. Abrams has been associated with humanitarian aid and trying to send weapons into humanitarian aid. Right here. This is New York Times. Great lady. Assistant Secretary of State Elliot Abrams has defended his role in authorizing the shipment of weapons and humanitarian flight to Nicaragua rebels, saying the operation was strictly by the book. Mr. Abrams spoke at a news conference Sunday in response to statements by Robert Drooling, former head of state for Departments of Nicaragua's Humanitarian Assistance Office, who said that she had twice ordered planes and shuttles, weapons for the Contras on aid planes at Mr. Abrams' direction in early 1986. Abrams, the person who's the point person for what is taking place right now in regards to, I think he's like the diplomat that Trump has appointed to Venezuela, once before tried to ship weapons through humanitarian aid. Just saying. Maduro has partially closed down the border to humanitarian aid coming in from the United States. I wonder why. If the person has a history of trying to ship weapons and using humanitarian aid, why on earth would you allow humanitarian aid in from a country that has instigated the crisis in your country and has sought to destroy and topple the government of your country and steal the resources of that country? Why would you allow aid into that case? All of these media outlets are screaming that they're not allowing aid in. No, they're not allowing aid in from countries that are trying to overthrow it. That's just called, good sense. Fact of the matter is they are allowing aid in from countries that are not trying to overthrow it. Nicolas Maduro, let's translate this. Nicolas Maduro announces the arrival of 7.5 tons of drugs to Venezuela. The president explained that the 108,428 units of medicine, surgical equipment, and equipment to strengthen the health system have arrived in the country. They are allowing shipments into the country. They just aren't allowing shipments from countries that are trying to overthrow it. Let's go to another point. Allow humanitarian aid into the country and refrain from violence against protesters. The guy who they put as a point person has a history of supporting death squads in Nicaragua or El Salvador. This notion of the instigator, meaning what is your government to do in this case? Somebody in the crowd provokes the government's reaction. Let's say you have the opposition in this case setting fires or getting into fights, or the government, it provokes a reaction. The government has to do something. The government has to protect the population, right? The moment that the government responds to a provocation by opposition, what's the first thing that takes place? Oh, the government is killing protesters. The government is killing protesters. These are regime change tactics that take place in order to try to create a pretext to invade the country militarily using proxy forces from Colombia. That is literally what is taking place here. When you're hearing stuff about taking place at the border, you got to be very wary of what is being said here from the standpoint of media, because media is being used as a political weapon in information warfare. it is very probable that a false flag takes place in order to try to create a pretext to instigate some kind of invasion into Venezuela from Colombia. In fact of the matter is, the NGOs and the humanitarian aid can be used as a proxy. And don't take my word for it. Look at NPR. Look at what NPR says on this. This is amazing. The U.S.-led effort to distribute tons of food and medicine to the needy Venezuelans is more than just a humanitarian mission. The operation is designed to foment regime change in Venezuela. NPR is even noticing, which is why much of the international aid community wants nothing to do with it. They want nothing to do with it. Humanitarian operations are supposed to be neutral. That's why the International Committee of the Red Cross, United Nations, agencies, and other relief organizations have refused to collaborate with the United States and its allies in Venezuela in opposition who are trying to force President Nicolas Maduro from power. Even NPR notices. Does Bernie Sanders know that? Does Bernie Sanders know that? Meaning, Bernie Sanders knows that this tweet is magnificently disingenuous. Because he knows everything that I just said is absolutely true, and that the behavior of the United States in this case is to create regime change. They're not doing it for the best interest of the Venezuelan people. They want to get their hands on those resources. They've called Donald Trump every name in the book, but in this particular case, they back the idea of him taking down another country. Find it to be amazing. Why is that okay? Why is it okay for the United States foreign policy to be the predator or prey on other nations? Just because you can. Any notion of international law in this case is out the window. Whatever you want to think of the Venezuelan government, it is not for the United States to determine who's the leader of that country, nor is it for the United States to intervene into the affairs of that nation. And that is exactly what we've been doing. Even telling the diplomats to not leave is an act of war. The president of a country has said the diplomats to leave, to say get out. The United States says, don't go anywhere. And if you go anywhere, there will be consequences. What are the consequences? What are you talking about? Are you saying that the person who's in charge of the country can't tell people, expel people from the country itself under threat of the United States, some kind of military intervention? I find this to be amazing. This is the language that we're using in this level of discourse. Taking down another nation after the failures of Iraq and Libya is perfectly okay. It's almost as if there's no memory of anything that's taken place in the past. There's no memory of things that have taken place 5 or 10 years prior. We just plod forward, fucking up as we go along and destroying nations and lives. This tweet from Bernie Sanders is woefully inadequate, and that's putting it mildly. The people of Venezuela. Second point, and let's get to this point, and let me go through this quick. The reason for this is obvious. The problem is, the politics of it is, the attack piece that is going to be used against Bernie Sanders is Venezuela equals socialism equals Bernie Sanders. And they're going to scream that to high heaven. And they're going to say it over and over and over and over again. Bernie Sanders, Venezuela. Bernie Sanders, Venezuela. And anything that Bernie Sanders says that's positive for Venezuela is going to be saying, see, look at Bernie Sanders defending his socialist hellscape. He's trying to turn the United States into a socialist hellscape like Venezuela. And look at all these tweets from Bernie Sanders supporting that hellscape. This is somewhat of an issue of politics. Now, I look at this and I'm horrified by this tweet because this tweet to some degree gives cover to the original premise that I find to be just utterly absurd. By the same token, Bernie Sanders is almost compelled by the scenario itself or by the incentives built into it to take this because this is going to be the direct attack on Bernie Sanders when he runs in the race for president. I asked my wife, what do you do? If you're Bernie Sanders and you're running in the race and you know that taking a position that is absolutely right is going to expose you to attack, what do you do? Do you take that position knowing that you have these other items on your agenda that you want to accomplish? And do you take that position knowing that you're trying to get to the presidency of the United States, meaning you're trying to get to a higher position, and that you need to get from point A to point B, and getting from point A to point B, this kind of political expedience, is not allowing them to attack you on this very specific front. Meaning when stuff like this comes up, you take these wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed, half-as regime change BS narratives because you're too terrified of taking a stand like Tulsi. Yeah, I didn't like this tweet. I didn't like this tweet at all. There is a First Last. I'm glad to have money to express my gratitude. Oh, thank you, First Last. Elephants on Coke. Just like prisoning of Lula and attempted coup in Nicaragua, socialism isn't tolerated in Latin America. If the coup in Venezuela succeeds, hello, Bolivia, purchase a dime sack with this $10. Oh, thanks, Elephants on Coke. I appreciate it. Yeah, you know, there was, what is it called, the pink tide at one point, where the governments were coming in that were more left-leaning governments. And look, even if you want to make the argument that there was mismanaging of the economy, I had to tell you there was mismanaging of the economy in the United States also when it was a crash in 2008. Nobody tried to topple the United States government. This is also why we were simultaneously screaming at the height of our lungs about Trump and Russia, saying that Russia instigated itself into our political affairs, while simultaneously literally attacking another nation in order to get your hands on their resources. And one Bernie Sanders excusing the behavior. I don't like this tweet, even though I understand the tweet. All right, I'm going to end this. I'm not going to keep this one. Let's see. Watching you cook for Bernie, Maduro, and starvation is more like... Look, if you care that much about starvation, the only thing the United States has to do is leave them to their devices. Full stop. I think I've made this point before, that I care about countries when we start to instigate ourselves into their affairs. And in this case, that is precisely what we're doing while screaming at the height of our lungs that Russia is instigating itself into ours. That's utter nonsense. Will he bow to the military-industrial complex? See, the catch is he's trying to run in a political race. And so it's like, what are the things that you're going to be attacked on? He's going to be attacked for being Venezuela. The Republican that was in his... that ran against Sanders in Vermont, used the same thing. Same line of argument in the debate. He's going to turn it to Venezuela. Donald Trump uses the same debate. Bernie Sanders is going to have the failed policy of Venezuela. They're trying to make that tether between those two things. Still, I don't care. I don't care. What's taking place there is just wrong. There are 50,000 plus folks sleeping outside without homes in Los Angeles right now. The United States does not care about humanitarian aid. No, it does not. Brian Adams, Jimmy Carter's election organization said Venezuela's elections was fair and democratic. Yeah, this is politics. This is they're shaping the narrative. It's not necessarily the reality of things. Patricia Valencia, boo, Bernie, boo, boo. Danny Knapp, bull like a leopard. You make every argument for intervention. You're a useful idiot. Yeah. You serve the neocons and don't even realize it. Yeah, I mean, like, this idea that you're making this argument that it's okay for the United States to kick over other countries is fucking nonsense. I'm sorry, it's not. You're not using laws for this. At this point, you're just using this kind of law of the jungle that might is right and we can do whatever we want. Yeah, I think that's nonsense. I think that's a BS perspective. All right. I'm going to end this because this has gone far longer than I wanted. But nevertheless, I think I made my point, even if it's a little long-winded. All the articles at the bottom so you can see for yourself at least where I get my information from. And I'll leave it there. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the PayPal or Patreon. And give me 1 second. Let me check Streamlabs. I try to make a habit of doing this because I don't want to drop the ball on this part. Alright, guys, thank you all for showing up. I will see you guys tomorrow morning. Thanks all. Have a good night.